Alrighty, let's get started. Welcome everybody to Chalk Talk, where we meet every week so that teachers, administrators, everybody who uses Lumos are able to hear about new ideas, share their experiences, but also ask questions and get support that they need to use our product. And today we wanted to talk about something that comes up in every part of our lives, but rarely gets the attention that it really deserves, and that's readiness. Think about how often you ask yourself that question of, am I ready? Am I ready for this interview? Am I ready to take this trip? Have I packed everything? Do I have all the ingredients that I need to make this recipe? But how often do we really, take a step back and ask ourselves about the system? Like, are we ready within this system? Does my kitchen have all the tools that I need? Has my car been serviced? But we really don't ask those questions until, we're on line 20 of the recipe and now I need a hand blender all of a sudden. I don't know where that is. Or I'm in the middle of my road trip and then all of a sudden we have a flat tire, but lo and behold, I forgot to replace the spare tire from the last time that blew out. And I think, the same thing happens in education where we spend so much of our energy asking, have the students covered all of the standards? Did they get enough practice? Did we focus on the remediation gaps? But then a lot of the important questions about the system, that's a completely different checklist. Do we have all of the standards mapped? Do we have a way to easily identify those standards? Are the teachers efficiently trained to be able to read this information that's being provided to them? And that's exactly why we have started working on creating this tool called the Readiness Reflection Tool. And, let's be clear, this is not something about scoring yourself, or we don't want you to walk away feeling bad about it, but we'd love to kind of introduce this today, talk a little bit about the concept behind it, how we built it out. And for that, we have Dr. Katz here. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. I'm really, really excited, especially because you have so much experience. You've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of educators in your tenure. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to jump right in.
Sure. Well, to the point of what you're talking about in terms of just kind of readiness on that bigger picture, it really is about the system that's in place in a school. So often we see schools that as testing comes up, they sort of shut down and they just try to cram everything into a very short time frame. And that's not only is it not effective, but it creates kind of a hectic, disorganized type of environment, um, which really is not a place where we find success either. In terms of the tool, and and we'll go through that and the elements that are with it, because we'll talk about five key points that can kind of be used as sort of a framework or just a guide for schools to, if you address these five areas and you do this throughout the year and you have a system in place, then, schools are going to find that students are more successful. I think one really important piece of this is that test scores are not just a reflection of the students themselves. It's a reflection of the school as well. And that's where these systems matter, because you could take the same student and move them into a different school or different school district, and their performance in all likelihood will change somewhat. And that's because how are they being prepared? How are they being taught in that school will certainly have a significant influence on the outcomes that those students find.
No, I think in our last Chalk Talk newsletter, we talked about like a hard truth of how these test scores really do matter and they open doors, they close doors. And I think that's a great point of how like the test score is a reflection on the school itself. It does make a huge difference and that's difficult to deal with, but it's, that they have that weight almost, right? That they have to carry on their backs when it comes to these scores. Um, does it feel like a relief or does it open up a harder conversation when you say that line or when an administrator says that test scores do reflect the systems and not just the student?
I think that's probably individually dependent, in terms of how an individual leader chooses to look at it. I don't think there's necessarily a lot of people that are huge proponents of the testing itself, but it's the reality of what we live in. And, we are measured by it in a lot of ways. I don't think it's the only measure. I don't even know if it's the most crucial. from an educator standpoint, but certainly, our parents, our communities look at that as a way of comparison and ranking us. Our state departments of education do the same thing. So, there are those stakes attached to it. But if you create the kind of environment in your building where it just becomes business as usual when test time comes around, then you can remove so much of the worry and the stress that comes with it. We can't control the outside environment, but as school leaders and we can control the environment in our school district, and we can control how we choose to message about testing and how we want people to feel about it. And then that does certainly filter throughout.
No, I love that. You talked about like those five areas earlier. Where do you see educators kind of feeling the most stretched, and where do they tend to be a little harder on themselves than they really need to be? And if you want to talk about those five areas first, please go ahead with that first. But I'm also really curious to learn like which is the hardest? Where do they really end up being more critical than they need to be?
Well, the hardest thing is always about time, and that probably comes up in every conversation you have
Yeah.
every week. I'm sure it does. But and that's why the readiness, the planning, and just kind of, I love the phrase, and I used to say this all the time in my school districts, we have a plan and we're sticking to it.
Yeah.
Say that constantly because schools are very good at change just for change sake, because something looks good on paper, because there's something new that came along. And that consistency is really, really important. In terms of the hardest place, it's really about, when I say time, it's not necessarily time to address a certain issue or a certain curriculum point. It's more so about time to just feel like I know what I'm doing. I know what's being asked of me. I understand what our larger vision is. I know what my role is in it, and I know how to carry it out. I know how I'm going to be assessed. And and those same things now I can tell my students and how it applies to them. So it's time in the sense of being organized and not always kind of succumbing or reacting to outside pressures that might, that do come along at various points of the year.
Yeah, no, just having a plan that's defensible, that makes a lot of sense. And I think with any plan or with any goal, especially if there's a goal for growth or you feel like you're not doing well and you need to get somewhere, I think there is a sense of vulnerability, especially for the leaders who are already giving everything they have and they're told that no, you still have to improve. How would you kind of go about creating a safe space where we can be honest about where we are and how we need to go forward? I talk to so many customers on a daily basis, and I think only one or two of them really feel comfortable with me using the term of, we can help you grow, or, we can definitely get you there, or because they feel like, they have to defend where they currently are at. How would you go about creating that safe space?
Yeah, I mean that's really just a culture question, and it's funny if teachers don't feel that way, then students don't feel that way either. When you make that comment, right? I mean that students will feel the pressure that teachers are feeling, even and not to say teachers can't hide it. Of course, people do the best that they can to do that, but if
Yeah.
you're so stressed to get students to a certain point, then they're going to feel like they're being pushed, and there's this kind of put pressure around it. So I guess that's where I go back to that business as usual comment that I made earlier, because, how do you create that? Well, for people in leadership roles, it's about taking that pressure off for teachers and saying, going back to the plan, this is our
Yeah.
vision. We are very clear on what we want students to know, what we want students to be able to do, and we're very clear on how do we accomplish that in our school district. And if we stick to those things, and we hold teachers' hands through the process, and we hold the hands of students through that process, then we're kind of all in this together. And it's really delivering that message of we're all in this together, and not, putting that pressure on that you're describing, where it becomes, and it is this way in so many schools, where there becomes this feeling of administration versus teachers,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed, as opposed to we're on the same page, and we're on this journey together to do. exactly what we've collectively sort of come up with, this, collective vision that best serves our community. And it's different from school district to school district. What I'm describing, it could be different because the needs of those students are different. You know, if you look at us as being educators as being in a service industry, well, what the people we serve are looking for in one community might be different than another, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's really about sending the message of support, togetherness, and that doesn't mean sacrificing or compromising standards. It doesn't mean that there's no levels of accountability. They definitely exist because in order to do these things that we're identifying, there has to be accountability for it, but accountability
Yeah.
doesn't have to be adversarial either.
No, I love that analogy as well of kind of looking at this like a service industry. There are going to be certain points that we need to meet, but as long as we consider ourselves all a part of the same team on the same side of the line, then getting there becomes so much easier. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Katz has put together a workshop for to talk about all of this, and I was privileged to witness that workshop. And I think my biggest takeaway from all of that was readiness is built and not crammed. And for anybody who's, listening right now and who knows that their school isn't where they should or where they like to be, what would you kind of tell them, Dr. Katz, is like a realistic first step that doesn't add more to their plate and seems like something that they can actually chew on?
Sure. Well, we could talk about those 5 points then, here and kind of start there. So the first one that's important is making sure that there's authentic practice and familiarity with the test that students are going to take. So what that means is making sure that the students are familiar with the format of the test, the navigation of the test, and that they've built up the stamina to be able to sit through those long periods of time. Because, we so all, and that's where, you just made the comment about cramming. That happens. And when that goes on, that's where students don't have the stamina that they need because they've only been doing this now for a few weeks. In terms of the format and the navigation, there's all different types of questions and tools that are within the test, whether it's the drop downs or the drag and drops and the extended responses and just the tools that are there for students to use in all of the different sections to help them answer those questions. If they get on and that's what they're kind of consumed with trying to navigate, then they're going to be distracted by that and not be able to get to the content, which they sort of, which they should have already learned and covered in class. So I think just making sure that students have done that before. So when they get onto that test, it's all right, let me look at this content. I don't need to figure
Mm.
out how to navigate. Something that I'll make an analogy to something in college football that happened this year, which was Indiana won the national championship. Indiana 2 years ago was the losingest program in the history of college football. 2 years later, they're national champions. And Kurt
What
Cignetti's the coach.
happened? Yeah.
And
How did they get there?
well, yeah. And, there was an interview with Kurt Cignetti the day of the national championship game. And they said to him, "How are you feeling today?" And they specifically said, "How did you sleep last night?" And his answer was, well, like everything else with him, if you are familiar with him, it's straight, direct, and to the point. And he said, "I feel great. I slept great. I woke up at 9:30. We're ready." And it's that calmness,
Yeah.
that confidence that this is just what we do. We're ready to go. And you can walk into schools when testing week comes along and that week it's frantic. People are running around. Is the tech all in the right place? Are the schedules all set? Are all the teachers covered? Do I know who's going where and when? And people are kind of running around like crazy. Or you could
Yeah.
go into other schools where we're ready and you
Yeah.
show up and there's a calmness and a confidence from students, from staff, from administration, because we're prepared. Our students are ready to take this test and we're ready ourselves. So yeah, I slept well last night. Our students slept well last night and we come in and we know what to do. So when you have that, that's, that certainly sets everybody up for success. So that's one piece of it. Another is making sure that your instructions aligned. So that word alignment, aligned to the standards that students are going to see when they're taking these tests. And I think it's also important to identify priority standards. And priority standards can be an area where schools have identified that they need more success from students, an area where their students are struggling. Priority standards can also be test standards that historically you've seen are more of a focus on the test. And it doesn't mean you ignore other standards or other skills that students need to know, but it means that your teachers know that you have a vision for this is what's important. This is where our focus is going to be. And that focus can't change every year. You can't come back and say, now we're going to do this and now we're going to do that. You have to build on, what the previous, it doesn't mean your focus stays the same, but it means you have to build on those things and you keep them there.
Yeah.
Sort of like when, there's that game, I guess people kind of go around in a circle and everyone adds a word and you have to say what came before it. And,
Oh, Chinese whispers. Yeah, I
right.
remember. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's like that, here's our priority standards that we're focusing on this year. Next year, you're adding to it. You're keeping
Yeah.
the ones from the previous year and you're adding to that. But it all has to be that we can walk into a school building and say to the staff, what's the vision here? What are the most important things that you've identified that you want your students to know and be able to do? And everyone should have that same answer.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the approach you're kind of defining here or leaning towards is don't think of test prep as 25, 26 school year. We did something, it's done. 26, 27 school year is a separate thing to deal with. It's an ongoing process that we have to continue iterating on. If we hit step one this year, we need to add on step two next year.
Yeah, that's definitely correct. And it's really just about good practice. And if you're consistently saying, here's our vision, here's our purpose, and we're giving everybody the tools to accomplish those things, then yeah, you're building on that every year. And that's what's going to get you there. We practice in schools, we practice everything.
Yeah.
Students practice in elementary schools, they practice lining up. So, like, how could we not have students practice for something, like the test as well? And so that's where here's the standards you're going to see. We're going to make sure that we teach those and that we're in sync with them. We're not going to keep changing. We're going to sustain our plan over time. We're going to be consistent no matter what's happening around us. And we're going to make sure these students have all these experiences that they need. So again, when they get there that day, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it really is just these key things. When we get there that day, students know what to expect from a navigation and tool standpoint. Students have the stamina to work through the test because they've been doing it all year long and they're familiar with the content. So they know here's how it's going to show up. So this is what the questions are going to look like. This is how long it's going to take. Here's the content that we've been practicing and covering, and I'm ready to go.
No,
So
I love that. And I think everything you've shared today kind of has that slightly bird's eye view perspective to it. We talked a lot about the vulnerability aspects, the weight that all of this can kind of have as a burden on teachers, students, administrators, everybody. And we're joined by a lot of educators today, like Kelly. I see Dr. Melendez is here. I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of how you feel about those first practical steps that Dr. Katz talked about, and also just overall, if you have any reflections on how these test scores kind of play a role in our lives that can be negative, but we're trying to turn it into something positive, I'd love to hear from you, and your experience in the many years you've been an educator. Kelly, are you on the call? Oh.
I sure am. Sorry, I thought someone else was talking. I heard someone else like come off mute, but oh, my camera's not on, is it? Hold on one second.
That's okay, no problem.
Oh, I got it to work. Okay, perfect. Hello, everybody. Um, yeah, so I agree with Rich on how hard it is having to teach to the test. Definitely not my favorite part of the job. But one thing I do like is being able to kind of gamify it. And one thing I do tell our customers, I love the smartboard option to kind of gamify teaching these standards because it makes it a little more not competitive as much as inclusive and gets everyone involved. You get up and moving. So I'm always kind of telling our customers fun ways to use that specific part of our portal to make it a little more interactive and fun than just sitting there and take practice test one, take practice test two, go through your remedials, which of course are also important, but we need to have a little bit of balance in the classroom.
No, totally. And I think we have a question in the chat that I would love for you to answer, but also Dr. Katz. So, to what extent does a teacher's familiarity with the test blueprint influence their ability to prioritize instructional standards effectively? I think a lot of what, Dr. Katz and I were talking about, what we're going to show you in the reflection tool is that system. How do we prepare that system, get the teachers ready? Did you experience maybe like a PD, or did you experience your strategy changing after you were more aware of how the state tests?
I mean, it's definitely, I'm trying to think because I've been doing this for so long. So I'm trying to think back like 20 years ago when I started doing this. But I mean, for me personally, I worked with students with that had accommodations, needed extra time. So for me, I always wanted to make sure my students knew how to answer the question types. And of course, we'd cover the standards, but for my students, especially those that had some physical accommodations that they needed help with, drag and drop is one that's always tough because of the way you have to pull it down. Multiple choice, multiple answer is another tough questions for students to understand. They would always argue with me, why did I get it wrong? There was two answers that were right, but there were three correct answers. And then, of course, the big one is those extended constructive response questions. Some of my students would just rush through it. Some of my students would literally wait until the last second to submit, and the rest of my kids are sitting there groaning because, they can't open their laptops and do anything else until every single person in the room finishes. So I think getting the chance to work through those different question types with my students beforehand and really prepping them on just that part was really helpful.
So, from a teacher's perspective, it's more about making sure the students know what to expect from a question type perspective. I love that. And Dr. Katz, how do you feel about the prioritization part? I know that, yes, it's important. That's definitely the obvious answer. But then what kind of shift do you see in the way students are progress or the way teachers are teaching when they have that priority list of standards in front of them?
Well, it becomes your focus. So yeah, I mean, obviously teachers do need to be familiar with the test because if we're asking them to help students become familiar. So you can't help students become familiar with something that you're not familiar with yourself. Uh,
Yeah.
and then it's a matter of, Kelly used the phrase teaching to the test, and that's not what is being advocated here. It's really about using just strong practices that are educationally sound that at the same time will set them up for success. And that's another phrase that I like. We want to set them up for success, and it's setting students up and it's setting teachers up for success. It's both really. So, the success on the test comes from just having that focus on this is what we have deemed effective instruction. This is
Yeah.
what we have deemed to be important in our building. And you stay focused on that. And then you can use the tools like, like step up program, because that gives the students that authentic experience that they can't otherwise have. But it's really just naturally integrating it into what you do all year long. And whenever I talk to customers, I always say to people, that my suggestion of the best way to do this is to naturally integrate the program into what you're teaching. So when you're
Yeah.
teaching certain standards to the students, use the portions that address those standards so that
Right.
it's happening at the same time. And it's not, okay, students, okay, class, now we're going to stop learning, stop what we're doing and do our test prep part. That's that's
Yeah.
not that's not what it is. It's part of learning specific standards, concepts, content, skills. And then this is one of the tools that we're using to help with that instruction.
And I think this kind of with like the answers that you and Kelly just gave go back to like the initial analogy that I made at the beginning of this, where if we're going on a road trip and we're creating checklists, I think Rich, you would kind of be in charge of making sure that the car is serviced, we have the spare tire, we have a strong system because your priorities are focused on what's the methodology, what's the approach that we're taking here. But Kelly is more focused on, do we have all the, like 5 sets of underwear? Do we have everything we need packed for this trip, ready to go? Because she's focusing on really helping the individual student as the teacher. And I just love that it kind of just worked out that way. But at the end, I think it makes a lot of sense in terms what does readiness mean to a teacher versus a principal could be totally different. But having that system really, really be robust in place at the beginning would be so helpful for everybody. I do want to take a pause for a second. We usually Chalk Talk is mostly focused on questions, things like that. Today, we're focusing on a tool that we have. I would love to show everybody, but if there's anybody on the call that has any questions, immediate requests, has a support ticket that they want to open, please use the chat and we'll make sure to stay on after the call so that we can resolve any of those issues for you. But if there's nothing or no other questions, no other thoughts that anybody wants to share, I would love to show you the tool itself. And Dr. Katz can walk us through some of those domains, what the question actually means, and what those answers also reflect. Okay, cool. I'm going to share my screen really quick. Let me know if you can see the state assessment readiness reflection tool.
We do say it. I do.
Okay, awesome, great. So it's free to use for everybody. It's really quick, 5 minutes. You get decent feedback, and you can also take a screenshot of the report as well. You get an opportunity to talk to Dr. Katz if you'd like to strategize a little further, but this is the first domain.
So
Um,
so the first two we already spoke about in pretty good detail. So the first one is about making sure students have that familiarity with the test.
okay.
So we can kind of go by
And
that.
then the second one is the digital testing platform. So making sure that that's good. Students regularly look at the style of the questions. That's what Kelly was talking about. And I'm going to answer these questions from the perspective of a school that's been using Lumos for the last 2 years or so.
Instructional alignment is what we also covered, being making sure you're aligned to the standards, making sure you identified those priorities standards.
Awesome.
And now here is about data. And so that is a really important key because it does beg the question, what we've been talking about is, well, how do you know which are the standards that we should focus on? And schools have a lot of data and it's sometimes used effectively and sometimes it isn't. And I think it's really important that schools dig deeper into their data in a way that makes sure that everybody exactly understands what the issues are that you're facing. So, for example, I've heard people say, "Oh, this year we're focusing on ELA. We're going to focus on our ELA scores because they're lower than they should be." But what does that mean exactly? It's not every aspect of ELA, and it's not every student. And, so we'll say, well, okay, so let's start to look at our subgroups. So our multilingual learners, only 30% of them passed. So we need to focus on our multilingual learners, our ML students, because 70% of them did not pass the test.
Yeah.
Okay, well, again, that's still pretty broad. What does that mean exactly? And what I start to ask is, okay, well, 30% of those students did meet the benchmark. So what's different about the 30% of the students who met those standards compared to the 70% who didn't? Because when someone says, "Well, our ML students aren't doing well," I always tell you the question, well, all of them, every single one of them? Well, no. Okay, well then who? Which students are they? And so in districts I've worked in where we really start to get into that data, we find some interesting things, and every year it is a little bit different in what you see in the data. But I know at some points, like what we have found is the students who struggle are students that are multilingual learners, but also economically disadvantaged. That really became students who crossed over subgroups were the students who were struggling more. And now you start to look, and again, I would go back to the other side of, well, what's different about the students who are succeeding?
Yeah.
And why are they succeeding compared to those who don't? What we found is there were significant differences in how students performed on our state test and even our other, internal benchmark testing that we used. Students who were in a district for 3 years or more significantly outperformed those who didn't, regardless of the subgroup or any kind of demographic identifier that they had. So that was something that we were proud of because students who were in our school system for a longer period of time were doing better. And so good for us in that case. However, we need to really make sure we're addressing students that are coming in for shorter periods of time, but then still have to meet the same standards. So we start to look at, okay, well, who are those students? They're not just new, but what subgroups are they in? And what areas are they struggling with? And now you can really start to target your intervention. Now you can really start to figure out where, what are the specific standards where these students are struggling and what is it about the students who are doing really well that they all have in common that we can try to replicate in others who are not having that experience.
I
And
love that. I
there's a
think,
whole, and there's a whole host of variables that comes into. And I've seen teachers, where you use these data systems and administrators too, where, some of these data systems will categorize students and into color. They color code the bands
yeah,
because it just makes it easier to, and it's helpful at the surface level. But then if you sit there and I've been in conversations where people say, well, that's a blue student, that's a red student, that's a yellow student. And yeah, that's where they fell, but that doesn't help you target their instruction. You need to actually look at where the patterns are for them very, very specifically, not they're a yellow student who struggled in ELA. They're a green student who's doing well in ELA. That's not what it is. There's going to always be pockets within the content area and then groups of students who have these commonalities that are helping them find success or not that you can kind of go deeper into.
I love that. So use Lumos for that baseline data, understand exactly where they need to be for the standards, but don't stop there. Really
Mhm.
look at the context, look at where that student is coming from, the environment they're learning in, and make sure you apply that context to whatever baseline data that you have. It is useful data, but don't let that kind of fester on its own. Make sure that it's not mutually exclusive from their
Mhm.
circumstances and all of that. I love that. That's a
Right.
great
And
approach.
and one piece of data should never be your entire picture that you make for students either. And so every piece of data that you have is just one piece. And that's why you need to put it all together. And you can't find those patterns without doing that.
Right, right.
So that
No,
leads to targeted intervention. And the next 2 points are really pretty straightforward. So if you have this data now and you understand that, well, we need to look at students who fall across multiple subgroups, or we need to look at students who have been in our district for a short period of time, or whatever it is that you're finding, gap in certain grade levels for some reason, or, whatever it might be. Now, are you using that to treat students as individuals?
hmm.
Every student's their own person, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Every student's their own person. So yes, it's a lot of work to personalize, and sometimes that gets sacrificed because it's easier to give generic interventions and kind of work with students in small groups. But that's not always going to address the issues that you're finding students are facing. So, are
Yeah.
we treating students as individuals?
It's also
That's
not easy. I mean, from
no,
a
it's not.
teacher's perspective, how many questions am I going to write? And like, how much am I going to do?
Yeah,
Um,
and it's not necessarily so that's where I think, you need to be creative in schools too, because everything can't fall on a single teacher or it doesn't have to fall on a single teacher for the students within their classroom. And so what I mean by that is if I'm in a middle school and I, am in part of the science department or I'm in, on the third grade team in an elementary school. Teachers need to collaborate with each other. So when you have this data and you see which students need assistance, you can collaborate with each other. You can switch students. Students can be fluid from one class to another because I'm going to work on something one day and you're going to work on something the other day. Sometimes that's an inconvenience for teachers. Some people find it exceptionally effective because I get to have the students in front of me who need help with something that I can help them with more so or in a different way than that other teacher. Or we're just, we're creating a more homogeneous environment for the purpose of intervention.
No,
specifically
and
for the purpose of intervention to be able to work on these skills. So even though one student might be assigned to my class and another's assigned to yours, if we switch those to put them with a group that it's going to be more beneficial for them, then that doesn't become then this added burden of I need to teach both. But I have a focus area and you have a focus area. And so we can help the students with what they need. So just those kinds of creative things, will take off some of that burden, but schools need to be willing to do those things.
And that leads kind of perfectly into this last point as well, where like if the teacher or the group of teachers even want to do the one thing of let's get this kid advanced in XYZ standards, they need to know how to use the tools that offer or allow them to do this, or they need to know how to read the data so that they can target those specific standards. I love the flow that you've put together. It does make perfect sense in terms of what should we look at first, and then where do we need to go from there?
Yeah, and the last point, thank you. And the last point does flow perfectly because the way I would sum this up is, are we helping teachers in the exact same way we expect teachers to support students?
Yeah, yeah,
Because that's what we should be
exactly.
doing. We should be using the data that we have there to help to then target, and not necessarily the word intervention, but to target support and professional development for teachers with the
Yeah.
exact things that they're going to need to be able to carry out everything that we just talked about for the last 30 minutes.
No, I mean, but if we, strip the ego from all these terms and look at it, it is almost like an RTI, right? Like
Yeah,
we have all of these sessions for students to prep for their test. Why not have something similar for the teachers as well?
definitely.
And this is what the reflection kind of would look at. You get a general idea of where you're at. You can ask some additional questions to our AI advisor. Just keep in mind, this is artificial intelligence. These are not recommendations that Lumos is making, but you can also chat with a real live expert, Dr. Katz. You can always book an appointment with him. And there's also a little bit of an analysis on the domains to kind of see how you're doing, what exactly is expected from those domains if you want to understand it a little bit more in depth. Overall, the tool
Yeah.
is as simple as it can be because we're covering a concept that is very complicated. So we don't want to kind of say this is exactly what you need for your school. Every single school is different. Make sure you reach out to us so that you can ask any questions or see if you need a tool that's more useful for group instruction or a tool that's just standard bare bones you want to give students their exposure to a practice test. We have a lot of different offerings, and a quick conversation with someone on our team would really help you understand how we can support you the best to get you ready for the state tests. But thank you so much, everybody, for staying an extra 8 minutes. I'm sorry we went a little over. Dr. Katz, thank you again for all of your invaluable feedback. I really love the conversation overall. I think your approach, the philosophy, I'm really a huge fan of all of that. And I hope that our schools also benefit from what we've talked about today. But until then, I will see you all next week. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, let's get started.